In this video, we will be covering how strong is the Dark Horse Comics Godzilla. Dark Horse Comics was founded in 1986, and just a year later they hit the road running with their first Godzilla comic in the form of the Godzilla King of the Monsters special. They would then go on to adapt the manga adaptation of the 1985 Godzilla manga based off the Return of Godzilla movie. However, we will be focusing on an original story created solely by Dark Horse, which the first story of which began with the 1987 King of the Monsters special, a black and white comic story starting with a Dr. Noriko reflecting back on her past as a child and how she lost her father in an attack from Godzilla. The rest of the story takes place in the flashback when Noriko is still a kid, as her father uncovers a Nope. Well, anyway, while the people are trying to move the rock, a giant worm monster attacks one of the people. Looks more like an eel, to be honest. Last time I checked, worms don't have eyes. Anyway, the slab foretells that every 1,000 or so years, these four ancient monsters will awaken to hunt for the slab for unknown purposes. 3 of these monsters are clearly based off traditional Toho monsters, one being a Rodan reference, one a Mothra reference, and one is, I guess, either an Anguirus or Chemobus reference. More turtle than whatever Anguirus was, an Ankylosaurus. And the 4th one is, of course, Godzilla, which is implied to be the strongest of these 4 monsters. Not that it matters, because none of the monsters actually fight each other in this story. Long story short, Godzilla finally appears, wrecks Tokyo hunting for the slab, scientist guy flies in a chopper over the bay to draw Godzilla away, when finally one of the other monsters, the Thunderbird one, shows up, before the slab drops into the ocean, where the 2 monsters swim after it, but the Thunderbird gives up chase because birds don't go well with water, and the story pretty much ends with neither the other previously mentioned 2 monsters even really getting in on any of the action. Getting back to the modern day, an older Noriko vows revenge against Godzilla, and the story pretty much ends. There were other design concepts for the other 3 monsters, which would have definitely had them look more like the respective monsters they're clearly based off of, including one King Ghidorah monster, although we would get a King Ghidorah-esque monster much later in this series. The continuation of this story wouldn't happen until 1992 with the Godzilla Color Special, which obviously has to take place before the rest of the comic story for reasons that will become obvious later. At this point, the humans have formed a dedicated force to taking down Godzilla called G-Force, and are sent to warn local islanders of Godzilla's impending attack. How they know Godzilla is arriving on this specific place is not entirely clear. The islanders reveal that they have a stone statue which is actually possessed by an Oni demon called Gekido-jin. I'm just gonna call it the stone monster. And in order to be able to control it and keep it stable, they have to sacrifice one of the islanders' spirits in order to be able to sustain control over it. Also, apparently the stone monster has a Zenkai boost ability where every time it gets destroyed, it reforms almost instantly and is stronger than before. I call hacks. Anyway, once the fight between the 2 monsters start, Godzilla destroys the stone monster with his atomic breath before it reforms and becomes larger, only for Godzilla to just one-shot it again with another atomic breath, go figure. When the stone monster does manage to get hits in with his hammer, he manages to shake the entire island just with the force of his hammer strikes alone. We'll come back to this feat later down in the video. The humans manage to stun Godzilla long enough for the stone monster to reform a 3rd time, and manages to finally hit Godzilla with his hammer, though Godzilla eventually just tackles him into the ocean, destroying him once more. However, at this point, the stone monster's out of range of the island, and is pretty much just now stuck there at the bottom of the ocean. Despite getting stronger with each defeat, the stone monster still gets one-shotted by Godzilla's atomic breath, and really only managed maybe one good strike on Godzilla the entire fight anyway. so I can't in clear conscience say that the stone monster got stronger than Godzilla at all during the initial fight. Though it might have been a different story if Godzilla hadn't used his atomic breath so much in the fight. Later on in 1993, in Dark Horse Comics issues 10 and 11, we finally get to see Dr. Narco make good on her promise to get revenge on Godzilla. Having developed a poison from Godzilla's scales, she fires the poison via a rocket launcher into Godzilla, poisoning him. A longer version of this story would eventually be made years later in 1995 with Godzilla issue 0, also known as Blast from the Past. It's basically the same story. This event would directly affect how the first issue of the rest of the comics starts off. We also find out from the Dark Horse Comics issue 10 that Godzilla first appeared 40 years prior to this story taking place, which was released in 1993, which would theoretically put Godzilla's appearance in the King of the Monsters special around 1953 maybe? And now that we've got not one, not two, but 3 prequel stories out of the way, let's finally jump into the official comic story proper. Oh, and just to be clear, I'm going to be doing things a little differently this time, where I mostly just focus on the story summary, as well as briefly stating who's stronger than who, and we're going to save the feat calculations for near the end of the video, just to make things a little simpler. Issue 1, released in 1995, contains probably what is the most recognized look for this version of Godzilla, him bleeding from the mouth. Though the title on the comic cover is a bit misleading, saying that Godzilla is hungry or thirsty for blood, when in actuality it's his own blood oozing out of his mouth due to the poison, which is confirmed at the start of the comic to have been 10 months prior, confirming that issue 1 takes place 10 months after issue 0. While we're on the subject, let's talk about the design for this particular Godzilla. Most versions depict him with a cream colorization, although some comic artists decided to depict him vastly different in design, making him look a lot more like the Heisei Godzilla. Given that this was in the 90s when those movies were at their highest in popularity, that's not entirely surprising. Though this design from issue 1's cover is probably the most iconic, as it even got an action figure made based off of it. Godzilla is not looking too hot, as apparently the poison is still affecting him 10 months later, and apparently the effects of it had slowed since he stayed in the water, but now that he's out of the water, it's probably going to affect him a lot quicker now, which makes you wonder why he's out of the water in the first place. Maybe spite? Knowing Godzilla could easily be that. Anyway, he rampages in Canada for a while until the Mechagodzilla stand-in Cybersaur shows up, ending issue 1. Issue 2 has the two finally fight, and while Cybersaur does manage to land some good hits on Godzilla, it's not really doing anything in the long run, and the crew piloting the Cybersaur decide to divert all power from the shields to the weapons to use their strongest weapon, but before they can, Godzilla manages to hit, which short-circuits Cybersaur, causing the death of its pilot, taking out the mech for the fight. The Canadian military, still sounds weird saying that, sets up a trap for Godzilla, where they basically try to replicate the attack the Japanese did with the whole electric fence thing, electrocuting Godzilla, except this time they use even more power than before. It doesn't work and Godzilla lumbers on. Round 2 ends as fast as it begins, with Cybersaur using its G-Buster attack at the very start of the fight, which seemingly manages to kill Godzilla, as apparently his heart had been stopped for over an hour. I want to debunk this feat that the Versus Wiki seems to point out, because there have actually been real-life examples of people coming back after their heart being stopped for more than an hour, with some even coming back after having their heart stopped for days. Then again, I can't be fully certain on when this kind of information came to be. It's possible these cases didn't happen until after this comic was written. I'm just saying, don't count it as Godzilla dying and then coming back to life. Though he does seem to have gifted timing, as when Godzilla fell to the ground, he let out a roar that could be heard all the way from space, which just defies the laws of physics as we know it, drawing in a new creature called Bagorah to Earth, kickstarting issue 3. It's at this point that they draw attention to the fact that Godzilla's blood is a irradiated, and him constantly spewing the blood due to being poisoned could have a negative effect on the environment in the long run. Bagorah makes planetfall, has a brief fight with Cybersaur, who manages to send it packing with a single shot from its laser cannons. However, upon round 2 between the two beginning, it tries a new sonic disruptor weapon, but doesn't seem to be as effective, and Bagorah downs Cybersaur with a single headbutt and proceeds to completely wail on the mecha, tearing it apart beyond repair. Seems like Cybersaur is a bit of a glass cannon where it can't really take a lot of damage, though apparently it was unfinished upon being sent into battle against Godzilla, so maybe that explains it. Such a shame too, it had such a cool design and quite a variety of weapons. It just didn't get to show them off that much, and it only succeeded in seemingly killing a weakened, poisoned Godzilla on top of that. Before Bagorah can take a chomp out of Godzilla, he miraculously revives, having been hit with an antitoxin right before Cybersaur's defeat, ending the issue. The next issue has Godzilla attempting to blast Bagorah with his atomic breath, only to discover that he's been weakened from the toxin so much he can't even produce an atomic breath. This also indicates that even though he's cured of the toxin, he hasn't been restored to full health yet, and that this Godzilla is even weaker than he was in the previous 2 issues, because even when he was sick, he was still able to produce an atomic breath, so we've got an even more nerfed Godzilla here. Bagorah gets bored and starts hunting for a bit, forcing Godzilla to pursue him all the way to Vancouver to continue the fight. Basically, Godzilla sort of tricks Bagorah into attempting to attack him while his dorsal plates glow, thinking that he's not going to actually fire an atomic breath, until he suddenly does, one-shotting Bagorah and sending him plummeting into the ocean below. Issue 5 continues on Bagorah's introduction, with alien hunters hearing word that the creature was defeated by Godzilla, which they believed Bagorah was the strongest creature in their galaxy. Intrigued, they head to Earth to hunt Godzilla instead. These hunters, called the Diani, are pretty imposing, being 25 meters tall, a quarter of the height of Godzilla. By the way, Godzilla is officially confirmed to be 100 meters tall, as indicated by various statements in the comic book themselves. Though there would be certain shots, such as this one here, where his size would be a little inconsistent. But again, we gotta go off official states. He's 100 meters. End of story. G-Force laments about Cybersaur's destruction and the lamenting about the loss of humanity's greatest defender. Charles Barkley has entered the chat. However, it's revealed that the human forces have already been building another giant robot monster in the form of the All-Terraintula. Stupid name. It's presumably stronger than the Cybersaur, or at the very least better in taking hits, as it has a special coating that allows it to absorb Godzilla's atomic breath and send it back at him. Sounds familiar. The giant spider continues its attack, using its agility to get out of Godzilla's reach, though Godzilla does manage to grab hold of it and sending it flying back into buildings. However, this doesn't seem to stop the giant spider, again proving it has much better durability than the Cybersaur, and it basically fires a cadmium tranq dart into Godzilla, once again robbing him of his atomic breath. Man, Godzilla just can't catch a break. He's getting nerfed in all these fights. However, the fight is interrupted when the alien hunters show up and one-shot the All-Terraintula with their Mega Zucker, reducing it to flames. Keep in mind that these guys were originally hunting Bagorah, so the fact that their weapons one-shotted the All-Terraintula probably implies that Bagorah still scales above both the All-Terraintula and of course the Cybersaur as well. Issue 6 basically just has Godzilla falling to the ground having been tranked by the cadmium thing, and the alien hunters revive him. Godzilla still doesn't have his atomic breath, so he just stomps one of the aliens into the ground. Issue 6 continues the fight between Godzilla and the alien hunters, as one of them pumps him full of arrows, but he manages to use that to impale one of the other aliens. Meanwhile, the humans have infiltrated the alien ship in space, and it's revealed that there is another alien faction in the form of the simian aliens from the Showa Godzilla movies, and they're going to use the alien hunters technology to take over Earth. So yeah, because one group of aliens wasn't enough, now we've got 2 of them. Issue 8 is the climax of this story arc, as the simian guy reveals that he's basically been sabotaging the humans since the first first issue, as well as the reason behind Dr. Noriko's death, the character from the first couple stories. They take control of the spider robot and go off to find Godzilla, who's just cleaning house with the remaining alien hunters, one by one. After the spider robot vaporizes one of the alien hunters, which really draws into question which is stronger between the two, the last remaining hunter picks up the spider robot and hurls it at Godzilla, who crushes it and absorbs the nuclear energy, restoring him back to full power along with his atomic breath. The resulting atomic breath basically sealing the fate of both alien parties for good. Yeah, the inclusion of the simian aliens just seemed kind of pointless, to be honest. And I feel like you probably could have condensed this story and saved at least one issue, but still an okay story arc overall, unlike the next one we're about to cover. I'm gonna quickly summarize issues 9 through 12 because I honestly feel like this was the most boring arc in the comics run. So generic mad scientist number 2 has a time machine and basically takes everyone on a joyride throughout time, intent on looting disasters after they occur, which are apparently going to be caused by Godzilla as it seems. The first event involves the Mount Vesuvius eruption in Pompeii, Italy, which one, it's hard to say, this volcano's erupted like 36 times. Then Godzilla's directly responsible for causing the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Gonna talk more about that one later. He also destroys the Spanish Armada during their failed invasion of England, 1588. Insert Spanish Inquisition joke here. And Godzilla also attacks the Titanic, and is credited as being the reason it sinks. So all these time travel shenanigans are permanently affecting history, which is just going to make this timeline a mess in the long run. Godzilla then ends up back in the present where the mad scientist loots a Victorian zoo. Kind of random there, but whatever. Godzilla finally puts a stop to this madness, where in his final time travel spot he ends up in the future in the year 2299, where he goes on a rampage destroying some future city stuff. Godzilla then swallows the time machine, destroying it along with generic mad scientist number 2, and ends up back in the present. Thank God. Seriously, I feel like you could have condensed this story arc to just 2 issues, but you managed to stretch it out to 4. And the human characters aren't even really able to do anything to stop this. Everyone's just kind of forced to go along with the mad scientist's antics as he teleports everyone to another time period before they get a chance to really do anything. Issue 13 finally has returned to form with another Godzilla versus another monster fight in the form of Burtannus, named after Bert Helzer for some weird reason. As it turns out, Burtannus is just trying to protect her 2 babies, and when Godzilla shows up, the 2 fight. Burtannus manages to actually draw blood from Godzilla. Godzilla responds by biting down her snout, and then fires an atomic breath directly into the wound, which does nothing. Burtannus then shocks Godzilla to the point where he's stunned and knocks him to his feet with a tail swipe. Burtannus then takes her babies and gets out of dodge. And that's pretty much the end of the issue. I'm gonna give the win here to Burtannus. Even though the 2 monsters appeared evenly matched, given that they're both able to draw blood from each other, Godzilla's atomic breath did nothing to the wound Burtannus sustained, and she was able to stun Godzilla long enough to escape. You could chalk this up to hysterical strength due to a mother fighting to protect her children, which, yeah, that's a thing. Remember that story about the one daughter who was able to partially lift up a car in order to rescue her dad or something like that? Yeah, it could be that case, or maybe Burtannus is just that strong. Makes you wonder where she's been all this time. First confirmed loss for the G-Man. Issue 14 has the G-Force members climb up Godzilla to try and shock him into unconsciousness. Wearing radiation suits, being smart, I see, they get attacked by the parasitic sea louse known as Shoturus, that thing that appeared briefly in the 1984 movie and was for some reason the only constant in all the scripts leading up to the creation of that movie. They eventually succeed in shocking Godzilla, and his fall to the ground activates the island's volcano, the lava awakening the monster. So much for that man. Godzilla attacks the volcano with an atomic breath, canceling out the eruption. And the issue pretty much ends. The penultimate issue introduces Dr. Yamazaki, also known as Generic Mad Scientist number 3, as she unveils her monster, simply known as the Lord Howe monster. Godzilla's just chilling on a beach in Australia when the monster shows up and attacks. Godzilla actually gets angry seeing as how, once again, he's not the first to draw first blood in the fight. You could say in this moment Godzilla gets a rage boost power-up, but doesn't seem to do much good. Even his atomic breath has no effect on the monster, as he's driven back into the city. Godzilla gets repeatedly knocked off his feet by the monster's eye beams, to the point where Godzilla has to resort to using his environment, fighting smarter, hitting him in the face with a train, before finally grabbing his pincer arm and impaling the monster through the throat with its own hand. I'm gonna say this is another instance where a monster's stronger than Godzilla, since Godzilla basically had to use the creature's own biology against it. Godzilla was on the back foot pretty much throughout the entire fight. I almost want to say this monster would be stronger than the last one too. The last issue is a bit of a bizarre one, starting off with Godzilla being crushed between two tectonic plates, continental drift or whatever, and it somehow results in Godzilla being sent to the far-off past to the Mesozoic era. Godzilla easily sweeps away a bunch of T-Rexes before getting into a fight with an alien monster simply referred to as the Stranger, which is a clear King Ghidorah reference. The two battle for a while and seem evenly matched, with neither one really gaining a clear advantage over the other in the fight, though apparently this monster isn't as immune to Godzilla's atomic breath as the previous two monsters. Eventually an asteroid impacts the planet, the resulting shockwave somehow sending Godzilla back to the present, while the Stranger isn't quite as lucky and gets destroyed in the explosion. Godzilla awakens back in the ocean, clutching the end tail of the Stranger monster, proving that the events of the story actually happened and was not a dream. This would sadly be the end of this particular timeline of events, as sadly the Dark Horse comics got cancelled not long after this issue due to poor sales. I blame the time travel arc. It's a shame too, because it sounds like they were gearing up for something big with Generic Mad Scientist number 3 about to unleash a whole army of mutant monsters on Godzilla, and that Godzilla was gonna inadvertently become the savior of humanity or something. I honestly enjoyed these last couple of issues. They brought back the monster versus monster fighting, and I feel like if they had been doing a bit more of that in the middle of the story, sales might have done better. Things were starting to get good, and then they suddenly ended. However, before I move on to the Feats analysis of this video, there's still 2 more stories to talk about, though whether or not they're canon is up for debate, mainly because I have a hard time deciding on where in the timeline this would take place relative to when the issues came out along with the main comic run series. These 2 issues being Godzilla vs. Charles Barkley and Godzilla vs. Hero Zero. Godzilla vs. Charles Barkley was a comic that came out in December of 1993. The plot is credited to an Alan Smithy, which is an alias name formerly used by members of the Directors Guild of America to disown a project, meaning the one behind this story was embarrassed and is trying to disown it. Personally, I think this story's pretty fun. Anyway, so Godzilla shows up, attacks the beach, the city, and whatnot, when a kid seeks out Sir Charles Barkley, the famous basketball player, and basically refers to him as Earth's greatest warrior, gives him a magic silver dollar that allows him to increase in height to roughly 300 feet, which, again, further proves that this version of Godzilla is around the 100-meter mark. Though according to a behind-the-scenes segment on the live-action commercial, Barkley was scaled to about 160 feet, which is about 49 meters, meaning that the version of Godzilla in the commercial is only around the 50-meter range. But apparently promotional t-shirt for the ad lists Barkley's height around 94.5 meters, with Godzilla using the 100-meter height. So Barkley challenges Godzilla to a basketball match, as you do, and the two seem to be doing pretty well against each other until Godzilla rage quits and destroys the ball in a fit of rage with his atomic breath. Despite this, Barkley has no problem picking up the radioactive, no doubt hundreds of thousands of degrees in Fahrenheit ball. After a scolding, he does give Godzilla props for his basketball skill potential. Leads into a remote canyon in Utah, where he gives him enormous Nike shoes and a hoop, asking him to do 1 million layups. He then returns the silver dollar and goes back to normal size. The second story, Godzilla vs. Hero Zero, came out in July of 1995 during the first couple issues of the Godzilla comic. Basically, a regular teenager named David somehow comes into contact with an alien that basically allows him to transform into Hero Zero, giving him superpowers as well as the ability to increase his height up to a maximum of 92 meters. He had a very short-lived run of his own comics before coming into contact with Godzilla, where the two have a fight. Godzilla seems to be doing alright for the most part, although during the scuffle, some debris lands on David's friend Billy, killing him. Upon seeing this, Hero Zero goes into a rage, easily dodging Godzilla's atomic breath and manages to drive the creature off, barely managing a win against the monster, carrying him out to the sea. However, this takes all that's left of Hero Zero's energy, and he soon transforms back. However, at the end of the story, David's so depressed about losing his friend that he did not want to be Hero Zero anymore, implying that Godzilla, while he didn't win the battle, won the war. Hero Zero would make one final appearance in December of 1995, in 2 separate issues where he would tangle with the Mask. Yeah, that Mask. So just to be clear, this is a universe where Charles Barkley is Earth's greatest warrior. The Mask exists as well as Godzilla. The Mask versus Godzilla win, people. Unlike the Charles Barkley comic, this story was actually included in one of the reprint re-releases of the Dark Horse Godzilla comic stories, which I think is safe to say that means that it's definitely canon, although where it takes place in the timeline is up for debate. Which finally brings us to the Feats section. Starting off with the Godzilla Color Special. The island where the story takes place has apparently been identified to be Miyagi-Jima Island. The island was shook by the stone monster's hammer hitting Godzilla, which has been calculated to be over 72 megatons of TNT, which is in the high city level range of power. Godzilla resisted a deadly toxin for 10 months, although this was mainly due to the water possibly slowing down the effects of the toxin, but still managed to resist it for quite a while even on land. I already talked about the whole reviving after his heart being stopped for over an hour. It should also be noted that Godzilla only started to awaken after he was shot with the antitoxin. In issue 4, during his fight against Bagorah, he resisted sound attacks which destroyed buildings, and in issue 7 against the alien hunters, he healed from a giant spear wound within mere seconds, with the wound completely healed just a few panels later. In issue 11, he lifted the 52,000-ton Titanic, although that shouldn't really be a surprise given how he's probably about 60,000 metric tons in weight alone, so of course he'd be able to at least lift his own weight, and caused the magnitude 7.9 San Francisco earthquake, which should be a little under 15 megatons, which is again city level. In issue 14, he canceled out a volcanic eruption with his atomic breath, which brings his attack potency to island level, and in the last issue, he survived the crushing of 2 tectonic plates, which has been calculated to be 12 gigatons, or also island level. Keep in mind though, we don't know exactly which tectonic plates he got trapped between, and the Versus Wiki does have other alternative calculations for this feat. Finally, to address his combat speed, well, in the Charles Barkley story, he reacts to F-16 Fighting Falcons, which move at Mach 1.2, and in the Hero Zero story, he reacts to F-15 Eagles, which move at Mach 2.4, which would give him supersonic reaction speed and combat speed. So how strong is the Dark Horse Comics Godzilla in conclusion? Well, going off the feats section, he displays a comfortable amount of city-level feats, but canceling out a volcanic eruption and surviving being crushed between two tectonic plates, I'd say makes him comfortably island level. That being said, I am gonna put him below the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla, not only because the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla has his laser vision, which allows him to weaken beings with atomic energy, but also because he's taller and possibly heavier, in addition to possibly scaling far higher than island level, though as mentioned in that video, the evidence isn't concrete enough to say for certain. Join me next time as we start covering the controversial but still important TriStar Godzilla from the 1998 movie. Trust me, you're gonna want to check this one out. Stay tuned then, folks. Take care.